This is Brad Bright with the God is the Issue podcast, where we seek to help make God the issue in every issue. This morning, we're talking to Dr. Seth Scott, professor of counseling and psychology at Columbia International University, as well as having his own clinical practice. In other words, he never sleeps. But it'll be a fascinating conversation today as we talk about the intersection between spiritual health and mental health. That is, between God and mental health. So, Dr. Scott, welcome to the program today.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, then, as we get going, let me ask, can I just call you Seth?
You're welcome to call me Seth.
Okay, good. But just so you know, this is Dr. Seth Scott. This is not to in any way lower his status and the hard work he does and the work he does on the behalf of the body of Christ. But this is a conversation between two guys, and we want you all to be a part of this conversation this morning. So, as we get going, can you in 60 seconds kind of tell us who you are, and then tell us something about you that no one else knows, maybe other than your wife?
Okay, I could try. So I grew up in Metro New York, New Jersey. My father runs a rescue mission, so alcohol and drug recovery. I grew up kind of in that environment around addiction recovery, Christian addiction recovery, and I'm the youngest of three sons. And my dad wanted all of us to go into counseling. He wanted to be the old guy in the rocking chair while we ran the ministry. And all of us said, we don't want to go into counseling. And one by one, we all ended up going into counseling.
I have to say, God does have a sense of humor. You say, I don't want to, or I'm not going to.
That's right.
Remember, God hears that. My wife always said, the last places I'd ever want to live would be Arizona or Florida. So we got married, we lived in Seattle, we moved from there to Arizona, there from Florida. Finally, a year and a half ago, we moved back to Colorado, so she's finally happy, you know. But God has a sense of humor, so when you say those things, God hears. But anyway,
it's true. Yeah, so I went to Bible college as my parents wanted me to, and met my wife at Bible college, and we went on the mission field for a while and recognized that while we had training and experience to kind of plant churches and understand people and church polity, people got saved and still had problems. And so we had to figure out, all right, how do we get additional training? So I went and got training as a master's counselor, worked in the Boston area for a few years doing pre- and post-psychiatric crisis care for families and children, and then went into teaching while maintaining practice. And so opportunities to kind of balance both of those roles in teaching. I train master's counselors, train PhD counselor educators, and then run a private practice and supervision, as you noted.
So when do you sleep?
I actually need a lot of sleep. I sleep 7.5 to 9 hours a night. I have two kids, 16 and 14. My wife is a full-time potter, does ceramics, and so we kind of negotiate our time. We built a new studio for my wife, and in doing that, we built a space for me to sit and read and grade while she's working in her studio in the evenings. So it works out. It works out well. I chunk my time well to make sure I get everything in.
So that's great. Now tell us one thing about yourself that almost nobody knows, other than maybe family.
Well, I was born 3 pounds 11 ounces. I was 2 months early.
Wow.
And my oldest brother, who was 6 at the time, was looking in the nursery and said to my mom, he'll probably be the biggest of all of us. And by 12, I was the biggest of all of them, and I am. I'm the biggest in the family. So
your brother has the gift of prophecy.
He does.
At least he did as a kid.
Well, and they also said I had all kinds of complications, and so they said, he'll either be semi-functional and mentally handicapped for the rest of his life, or he'll die. And my brothers regularly joke he's not dead. So leave it to the brothers to keep you humble, right?
Oh, that's why we need siblings. They help us keep our feet on the ground.
That's right.
Well, let's kind of jump into this today. A number of years ago, probably 10 years ago, I read a poll, and it was either by Gallup or Pew, I can't remember. But it was a global poll, and they wanted to find out what was the happiest nation on the face of the earth and what was the unhappiest nation on the face of the earth. You know where the U.S. fell on that?
Pretty low. Yeah.
At the very bottom. The unhappiest nation on the face of the earth. Nigeria at the time came out as the happiest nation of the earth. And you look at that and go, that doesn't make sense. But when you really begin to unpack it and you look around America today, You see the angst, the anxiety. It's worse today than it was 10 years ago.
Yep.
But in light of that, is there truly a mental health crisis in America today? What is your opinion on that and why?
Yeah, I'd argue that mental health is the pandemic from what we've been experiencing. So the research demonstrates that loneliness precedes anxiety, depression, and addiction. And so in a model of trying to promote safety, we've actually isolated people more and more. And the literature shows that today more people would respond with 0 as the number of friends that they have that they can call on than ever before. Wow. And so as we become more lonely, more isolated, our need for safety, security, and protection increases, but we don't have anyone to rely on. And so we become more anxious and depressed, and it creates this vicious cycle then where, people around us trying to engage in relationship actually make us feel anxious, so we avoid, we numb, we escape. And that just perpetuates it.
So would you say loneliness is the primary cause of mental health issues in America today?
I think loneliness is the symptom of a struggle to connect well with others, because the nature of the fall, of sin, is a disconnection between God, ourselves, one another, and creation. And so what we're seeing is just the erosion in our culture of the foundation of Judeo-Christian principles of connection and relationship, of pushing people beyond their comfort zones to engage. And as we've leaned more into a selfish lens, we're just seeing the ramifications of selfishness, of self-pursuit, like Romans 1 would explain.
Self-centeredness.
We've exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and we think that pursuing our own needs, our own desires will satisfy. And now we're a generation or two into that lens, and that's why we're seeing the spike in loneliness and in all of these mental health issues.
Now, obviously that's true in the broader culture. Is that true in the church as well?
It is true in the church. Actually, the study shows that it's true across white nations, right? First world nations. So the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, all exhibiting the same levels of loneliness, the same issues with mental health. And faith doesn't seem to be a determinant on whether you're going to experience mental health issues or not. The other complicating factor is genetics, epigenetics, and biology.
Well, yeah, and we know that plays into that as well. We've all had friends that have. I used to date a gal who every 3 or 4 hours had to eat protein, and if she didn't, you could just see her mood change. But as soon as she got some protein, then she was fine. Yep. So there was that physical connection as well. But what I'm sensing today, and you're kind of confirming it, is the primary driver of this is not biology, although it can factor in. Mm-hmm. But the primary driver of this is alienation, really, yep, from God and from each other. And as I read the scriptures, it seems pretty clear that he said, love your neighbor as yourself, but her verse said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and then love your neighbor as yourself. And I've become convinced it's hard to do the latter if you're not focused on doing the first one.
Yeah, well, we're holistic beings, so we can't really separate our biology, our mental health, from our spiritual health. All of those things are tied together. And so even when we talk about spiritual health versus mental health, the way we experience God is through our emotional lives, our social lives, our physical lives, right? The body matters, otherwise we wouldn't have the incarnation or the resurrection.
That's true. Actually, I had dropped out of college for 2 years because I had picked up a parasite in the Soviet Union, and now, the Soviet Union is no longer there. It's Russia, but they're trying to be the Soviet Union again, I think. But I picked up this parasite, and up until that time, I always kind of looked down on people who couldn't get their act together. They weren't feeling well, health wasn't good, but they fell apart spiritually as well, and I just thought, yeah. And then, of course, I got this parasite, and I just everything fell apart. And for 2 years, I was at home. I read the book of Ecclesiastes every night, because that's where I was. I was depressed. But it was caused by the physical side, and I didn't have the spiritual maturity at that time to kind of begin to rise above that. Over time, God builds into us the strength to rise above our circumstances. But, when I'm 20 years old, I hadn't learned the lessons I needed to. But even then, physically not feeling well does affect our emotions, our feelings, and even it can affect us spiritually. I would agree with you on that.
Yep. Maybe think through the ramifications. If you're not feeling well, so you don't attend church, you miss out on the community and the spiritual encouragement that you would receive in that social engagement, which then creates, a backlash on our week.
Yeah, it really does. So, what is the connection between spiritual health and mental health? With Alcoholics Anonymous, part of the 12 step is really belief in a higher being. Well, what it really is the connection there that you see as you've seen it on a practical level in counseling?
Yeah, well, even the first step is to admit that we are powerless over our dependencies and our lives to become unmanageable. That's that first recognition that we are not self-sufficient, that we are dependent on God for life, for functioning. And so that's a huge piece, is that if we attempt to be self-sufficient, if we feel like we don't need anyone or anything else to tell us what to do, then that leads to spikes in anxiety, because we are the only one that we can then rely on. And things that happen outside of our control, then we are responsible for. And we have to keep ourselves safe. Like Ecclesiastes says, right? A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken, is that you need a friend so that when you fall down, someone can help you up. So if you're alone, if you're all by yourself, and if you're the only one that is the arbiter of truth and reality, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy to feel isolated and scared.
Yeah, and where do you go when you start feeling that?
Yep.
I think that's, and I suspect you would confirm this, is I believe that's what's driving the suicide rate today.
Well, yeah, if life is meaningless, and you have to find your own meaning, and you can't find your meaning, then you might as well stop looking.
Yeah. As Nietzsche said, the only significant question in life is how I'm going to end it.
Yep.
And if God doesn't exist, then that really probably is the only significant question in life.
Mm-hmm.
Seth, Jesus promised us his joy and his peace. That should be our normal daily experience. Now, the curveballs can come, but that should be our normal daily experience. And I've come to the conclusion, if it's not, then either Jesus lied or I missed something. How does that factor into to how you do counseling, especially with believers?
I think part of it is understanding the meaning of the terms that Jesus used. And so when we think of peace, or we think of joy in contemporary culture, we think it's the absence of difficulty and the pursuit of happiness. That's the American way, is peace, joy, happiness. And yet when Jesus said peace, he didn't mean the absence of strife. He meant shalom, which was wholeness, completeness, a return to perfect relationship with ourselves, with him, with others. And joy is this capacity to experience self in connection to others. And so when we talk about joy and peace today with believers, it's this recognition that as people made in the image of God, we aren't fragile. We're actually anti-fragile. It's this leaning into struggle, strife, difficulty to allow us to grow, to become more aware of our dependency on God. And in that connection and relationship, in that restfulness, we find peace and joy. Just like we see in Mark 2, Jesus is in Peter's house, or his mother-in-law's house, and he's teaching, and all of a sudden the roof opens and the paralytic comes down. And Jesus says this confounding question of, which is more difficult, to say, take up your mat and walk, or your sins may be forgiven. And actually, I'm not sure which is more difficult. It seems easier to say your sins are forgiven, because you can just say, anyone could say that. But the reality of saying your sins are forgiven is much more difficult than healing someone, because then you are God. And he gives this peace. And if you're the paralytic, in my position, I just wanted to be healed, right? I wanted to walk. I didn't care about my sins. And yet Jesus frequently goes beyond our selfish needs, our selfish desires, and actually addresses our true need, is connection and relationship with him, which is more difficult. And so we see that in joy and peace and happiness and counseling as well, is that true counseling actually has to push beyond whatever the presenting concern is of, I want this to go away, and actually deal with the real need of, how am I understanding who God is? How am I relating to God and to others as a self? And do I just want this need to go away, or am I leaning in dependency on who God actually is? And so that's this bigger challenge, I think, that Christian counseling can address, is that we're willing to sit in suffering in a different way than secular counseling would deal with. Because as Keller says in Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, is the worldview of the secular world around us is that the purpose of life is happiness, and that pain is an interruption to that happiness. Whereas the biblical lens would say that the purpose of life is holiness, and pain, suffering, difficulty is a forge by which we lean into dependency on God and are made more like Him.
Yeah, I often will tell, especially young people in the church, I'll get up and say, look, if you don't really understand who God is, the Christian life will never really work for you. And they all kind of lean forward and go, well, what does that mean? What do you mean if I don't really know who God is? And to begin to unpack that, we all think we know who God is. But until we really get into God's Word and unpack, what does it mean that God is love? It's not what most of us think. What does it mean that God is just? What does it mean that God is holy? I mean, what most people don't understand is that we really, really want God to be holy. We see the holiness of God, go, ooh. But if God's not holy, it's His perfection. And don't we want a God with perfect love and perfect justice and perfect mercy? I mean, that's His perfection. So as we begin to dig into the attributes of God, I've often said, you can't fix yourself. I know you can't because I've tried. But here's what I learned: if I do fix, I begin to change. And what it is as I fix my view of God, as I deepen my view of God. A number of years ago, a friend of mine, who was about 10 years older, Kathy and I had been married for about 5 or 6 years, and we were really looking at making a major change. And I called my friend out, Chuck. I said, can we get together and talk for a day or two? I mean, just to talk through these things. He said, sure. So I was up in Seattle at the time, where Kathy and I were, and we went to Vancouver, BC, and Chuck and I walked the streets of Vancouver for 2 days and talked. Well, I'll never remember, at the end of the first day, he turned to me and said, Brad, your intellectual theology is phenomenal. And I remember thinking to myself, yeah, it's pretty good. But then the other shoe dropped. He said, but your application stinks. You see, what he was saying is, yeah, I understand you understand who God is in your head, but you're not applying that to your daily life. And here I was, Bill Bright's kid. I grew up in a great Christian family, had great role models, and yet I still had missed it. And I ask people all the time, if I missed it, do you think it might be possible that you missed it too? Even if you have a great view of God in your head, which most people don't today in the church. But even if you do, are you applying that to your daily life?
Well, that's one of the benefits, actually, of counseling, is because if someone is coming to counseling, there is an aspect where they say, something's not right. I acknowledge that something is wrong with my either experience of the world, my view of the world, and that gives us an opportunity to say, all of our understanding of God comes through our experiential lens, comes through our relationships in the world around us, and it's all imperfect. And so as we seek to refine our experience with God, our relationship with God, if you are aware that it's a lens, that it's an assumption, that it's a perspective, then you can make adjustments to it. If you aren't, then it's going to be really hard to make those changes. We say, when you're looking at something like Celebrate Recovery or AA, frequently the response is, I wish church were more like this. I wish people were able to say, I am a sinner saved by grace when we walk into church. Instead, we have this felt need to put our mask on, to keep it all together. And that doesn't allow us to sharpen, challenge, and grow with one another, because we're then just comparing to false realities around us.
Yeah, too often I see in the church, we make Christianity about my behavior rather than about my focus. I love the statement you made in one of your articles that I had read. You said something like, your focus determines your direction. Can you unpack that a little bit? I think that's important for believers to understand.
Yeah, so I would argue in most things in life, where we are looking decides where we go. And there's a psychological principle called the Moth Effect, which, as we look towards flashy lights, that's where we go, like a moth to a flame. And so what we think about, what consumes our attention, drives our behavior, and we end up in that place. So in counseling, if we're only focusing on the past and we're focusing on people that hurt us in bad relationships, we're never actually going to walk in the right direction. Whereas Jesus said, that instead of worrying about tomorrow, worrying about all these different things, seek first the kingdom of God. He's not invalidating the anxieties of the world around us. He's saying, focus on me first, walk towards me, and you'll find that I'll take care of those facets of life. And so the direction that we go is really where our sight is leading us. And so if we're going to walk correctly, if we're going to allow the Word of God to be a lamp before our feet and a light before our path, then that's the direction that we need to be looking. The other component of that actually is that in order to experience freedom, we need to have discipline. And this is that aspect of, I would say, I have teenage kids. If I want to be able to continue to compete with them in sports, if I want to continue to be able to play basketball with my son, then I want the freedom to do that. I need the discipline to stay in shape, to eat healthy, to get sufficient sleep, to exercise. Otherwise, I limit my freedom to be able to then act how I choose. So discipline actually is necessary for us to experience freedom across the board. If I want to know who God is, I want the freedom of relationship with God, I need discipline to spend time in His Word, to spend time in conversation with Him through prayer and in communion with His saints. Otherwise, I don't actually have the freedom to pursue those things.
Yeah. And although, let me say to you, give it 10 or 15 years, and it won't matter how much you work out, you will not be able to compete with yourself.
It's true. You got to enjoy it while it's there, right?
Enjoy it now, because it's going to go away. As I'm learning at my stage of life, not quite as quick, not quite as strong, not quite as sharp as I was, 10, 20 years ago. So,
yep.
So enjoy it now, but you have to keep working at it to get there. What you were saying reminds me of a statement I've made many, many times over the years, that either your experiences will determine how you see God, or your view of God will determine how you see your experiences. In any situation, it will be one or the other, and that's all about where's your focus. Where is your focus? My dad, the last couple of years of his life, I would often ask him, Dad, how are you doing? He'd say, I'm rejoicing in the Lord. And I would go, Dad, I know you're rejoicing in the Lord, but how are you feeling? He only answered that question twice. He said, I'm not feeling very well, but I'm rejoicing in the Lord. He died of pulmonary fibrosis, where you just slowly suffocate to death. Well, I really didn't understand the import of that until about 2 or 3 years after he had passed away. And a lot of widows came to my mom, whose husbands had also died of pulmonary fibrosis. They said, it's an awful disease. It changed my husband. He became mean and surly. I didn't recognize him as the man I married. And I went, oh, my dad was the same guy he'd always been till the day he died. And I went, oh, I'm rejoicing in the Lord. Where was his focus? His focus wasn't on his disease and his dying body. His focus was on God Himself. How many times did I walk in his bedroom those last couple of years? And he would have fallen asleep, glasses slid down his nose, he kind of propped up in the pillows, his Bible open. His focus was on God in the midst of this awful, awful disease. So that he was the same man until the day he died. And that was a huge example to me of the difference my focus makes. So I'm focused on myself or my experiences. Of course I'm going to be miserable. But if I'm focused on who God is in the midst of those circumstances, it changes even how I experience the circumstances many times.
Yeah.
So, but let me ask a question. Let's kind of shift gears here a little bit. In the larger cultural debate, how can we use the mental health issue to help make God the issue in relevant ways, with all the violence and the suicide going on? What have you found?
I think part of it is asking this question of, what is happiness for you? What are you striving after? There's a common therapeutic strategy called the miracle question. It comes out of Gestalt, and I've adapted a little bit. I have a plastic Harry Potter wand in my office.
And the first part of it you lost me, but I get a plastic Harry Potter wand.
Yeah, and so I hand it to the client and I say, if this wand were real, and I didn't buy it at Walmart, if this were a real wand and you waved it around, but it didn't work immediately, you went to bed, you woke up the next morning, and everything were how you wished it to be with that wand, how would you know that wand worked? What would actually be different? part of that question is people have a hard time defining what their goals are, how they want life to be. But if you think of how it were, if everything were the way that you wanted it to be, then we could work backwards on those goals. And that's part of that frame of saying, is the problem the suffering, or is the problem your perception of how you think life should be, in that forge or that happiness, the holiness or the happiness lens? And so part of the discussion, I think, with people around the topic of mental illness is, how should life be? What should life be like? Should it just be easy for people? And I think we're a generation into that perspective of self-esteem for self-esteem's sake, that we should have every comfort. And I think we are seeing the ramifications, the implications of comfort for comfort's sake. There's a book I read, I think it's The Comfort Crisis. And the author of that book gives the example, even in the chairs that we use. So in a lot of ancient or even third world countries, when people rest, they go into a squat crouch that activates a lot of the muscles in their body to sustain that posture, but it's a resting position. Whereas we in first world countries go into rest, we'll be engulfed by a lazy boy recliner.
Are you saying I have to get rid of that?
I'm saying that what happens is all of your muscles then are inactivated, and it actually causes us to atrophy, and we have more injuries as a result of not exercising our muscles. I mean, that's what it means to get old as well, right? I used to be able to say, I did this, this, and this, and that's why I'm sore. Now I used the wrong pillow, and that's why I'm sore. So the world that we live in, part of it is understanding whether the goal in life is growth and being anti-fragile, pushing against difficulty, or whether the goal in life is the avoidance of difficulty. And that's the underlying, whether it's Christian or not, actually, that's the underlying issue with mental health, is how we think through why we experience suffering and whether we should experience suffering, whether life should be easy or without problem. And I think what we find in our culture is, as we have less and less problems, smaller and smaller things become the problems that we focus on.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm sure you're aware of Dr. Christian Smith's moralistic therapeutic deism, that whole concept, where the chief end of God is to make me happy. Instead of the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever, the chief end of God is to make me happy. And I see that throughout culture and the church today. Mm-hmm. The problem is, with that thinking is, what happens the first time a major curveball comes into your life? A major problem where a friend is killed in a car wreck, or you have health issues, or something is going to happen in lives eventually that's going to say, I'm not happy. What happens to people? I mean, you're on the front line of dealing with these people. What happens to people who think like that when the major curveballs come?
Well, I mean, we surprisingly have higher rates of trauma in our country than in Israel. And it's not the exposure to traumatic situations, it's our perception of those situations as an interruption to life. And then it changes our physiology. So our physiology then is constantly on alert in perceived threat and responding in stress response in preparation for trauma when we're sitting in traffic, which leads to higher rates of heart disease. You know, all of the stress diseases are actually higher in our country than in places that have higher incidence of trauma. And it goes back to our perception of whether we should be safe or not. And so as Christians, we have an aspect, even those of us who would be strong evangelicals, of I call it prosperity gospel light, right? I do my devotions every morning. I pray with my family. I give to the church. I care for other people. I walk elderly ladies across the road. Why are bad things happening to me? And we don't really, that's an Americanized evangelicalism, that we don't really have a lens to understand what life should be like. And so part of addressing people is just asking that question is, well, how do you think things should be? And why do you think they should be that way? And then what control do you have over whether that happens or not? And what do you do if you don't have that control?
I mean, that's powerful. So, growing up around Campus Crusade for Christ, now called Crew in the U.S., we've always emphasized the spirit-filled life. And what I finally started realizing after years is a lot of our staff weren't experiencing the spirit-filled life, even though we taught it. We thought this is what it looks like. This is how you do it, But I think for a lot of them it became a formula. But worse than that, their expectations is, so I should have the abundant life. Translated, everything should be good and I should be stress-free and there shouldn't be bad things that happen to me. But of course, we all know bad things eventually start happening. Some way or the other, something bad's going to happen. And so a lot of our staff would come to the conclusion this, the spirit-filled life doesn't work. And I thought, and I pondered that for a long time, and finally one day I realized the spirit-filled life doesn't work if you have a broken or inadequate view of God. Because all the spirit-filled life really is a relationship, a give and take relationship with the Spirit of God. It's a relationship. And if you don't understand who you're in a relationship with, the relationship doesn't work very well, does it? And so I've learned it's important to help believers understand who God is, but in the practical ways, ask them the so what questions. God loves me. Well, so what? What does that really mean? Does that mean he gives me everything I want? Well, no, I don't give my kids everything they want, but I do make sure they have everything they need in order to grow and to flourish. And sometimes, in order to do that, I have to say no. And sometimes I kind of let them go through hard experiences so that they can grow. Yeah, I have to say, I've grown far more in the hard experiences of my life than I ever had in the easy experiences. Right now, I have stage 4 metastatic cancer, and the doctors say we can't heal you. We can extend your life a little longer, and you think, well, that's a bummer. And yet, since I got that diagnosis, I have not been this excited about life in years. It's like, okay, God, what are you going to do today? And he hasn't told me what he's going to heal me or not. But he said, Brad, trust me. Trust me, I'm your coach. So as a coach, my job is to make you do the stuff you don't want to do so you can become who you want to become. And he said, that's what we're going through here. So trust me in this whole process. So it's a proper understanding of who God is helps us move past those things, I think. But I think with believers many times is we have this unrealistic idea of who God is and what his role is in our life.
Well, part of it is I think, I'm biased as a counselor educator, but we think that Christians shouldn't need counseling either. I view counseling, for some reason, our field hasn't been able to grasp the same market share as dentists. I view counseling like going to the dentist. And for some people, it's probably just as painful. But you don't need to have a problem to go to the dentist. They've convinced us that we should go every 6 months for cleaning and checkup as a preventative strategy. That's how counseling can and I believe should work in the same way. Same as the medical doctor. You go get a physical. Not because there's necessarily something wrong, but because you need a new set of eyes, a different perspective to kind of check where you are on a holistic lens. That's what counseling does. It's someone that is trained to see you through a different lens and to provide insight, input, and direction through this holistic lens to kind of kick the tires, to make things healthy and functioning, to teach you tools and address strategies of correction in how you're thinking.
Yeah, and that is so important. And lots of times, good friends who have 20 years more experience than we have also can serve in that role to a degree. And I've had older friends of mine that have served in that way, who've kind of held the mirror up and said, Brad, here's what I see. And sometimes I go, ouch, okay? But it's good to see me through their lens.
Yep.
It helps me grow. It helps me see the issues where I need to learn to submit my will, my issues to the Spirit of God for true healing. I used to think I had it all together. Of course, then I got married and then I had kids, and it's like, what happened to the guy who had it all together, right?
Yeah. Well, and a danger of counseling, even in the church, actually, is that we use counseling in place of some of those relationships, actually. Because as a counselor, I'm going to hold you accountable on some things, but maybe not to the same degree as a friend would. I'll be a little bit less directive, a little bit less hands-on than a friend saying, like, that was stupid, why'd you do that? And we need that. And so counseling, actually, we're seeing the concern across the board in counseling is that it's a safe way to have your emotional needs met without the risk of friendship. So friendship requires risk. Friendship might mean rejection, but a therapist will be there when you schedule. And so part of therapy actually requires that we identify this and push people, again, in growth to say, I don't know that I am the right person for this. I think you might need a friend for this. And there's nothing quite as difficult in my experience. There's two things that are really hard to address in counseling. One is increasing self-awareness. If someone lacks self-awareness, they lack self-awareness of their lack of self-awareness. And so how do you address that? And then the other thing, which is related, is making friends. Most of us don't know how to make friends. We just did make friends. And it's related to proximity, common experience, and time, right? We see the same people regularly. We make friends in third grade. My son comes home from third grade and said, well, what'd you do today? Well, I played with my friend, right? Often he didn't even know their name, but he spent 6 hours playing with them because they enjoyed the same things. Yeah. And then we build mutual common interests by time together. As adult men, one of the difficult things that I work with, couples that get divorced, 50-year-old males don't know how to make friends.
Oh, I've seen that again and again and again and again, especially males.
Yeah, and then that leads to isolation, which leads to depression, anxiety, and addiction.
Yeah, and that which explains where we are as a culture today, doesn't it? I mean, I did a podcast on Dylan Mulvaney, Budweiser, and Jesus a couple weeks ago, and it's just the alienation is just tearing our society apart at the seams. But and this leads me to the bigger question of how do we engage the cultural question. And in that podcast, I talked about never compromise truth, but never compromise love. So how, and this is a little shift in our conversation today, how do we engage the culture in the important questions, never compromising truth, but never compromising love? What does that look like?
I think our underlying need as people made in the image of God is to be seen. Right? When sin happened, the first thing God was looking for Adam, and he said, "Where are you?" And sin causes us to hide in shame and guilt. The first person to name God in the Old Testament was Hagar, who says, "You are the God who sees." The first person to which Jesus revealed himself in the New Testament was the woman at the well in John 4. And she says, "This man sees me and knows me." So God is the God who sees. And in our culture today, this is the implications, is we want to be seen, we want to be truly known, but we're, like Adam and Eve, afraid to be seen and truly known. And it's this juxtaposition between these two things. See me, know me, accept me, and love me, but don't actually see, know, and accept the real me, because I'm afraid to represent that because you might reject that.
You might pull out your hammer and hammer me, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Here's a question for you. All of us, except for those of us who have the gift of compassion, the rest of us tend to pull out our hammer rather than our fishing pole, don't we? Mm-hmm. What does it look like as believers to pull out our fishing pole and leave our hammer at home? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think it's having curiosity, asking questions. In the counseling field, it's called cultural humility, right? It's this piece of saying your experience of the world, the lens through which you perceive life is different than mine, and I'm curious to see kind of how you have experienced it, to attempt to find common ground, but also to see, well, your lens perceives things differently than how so I might try to communicate something to you, and I might use, as you say, actually, and God is the issue, I might use language like baptism or born again or conversion or crusades, and because of that, I might be perceiving it one way, but they might be perceiving it another,
very different,
and we lose ground. And so instead, I try to take an open, questioning, curiosity approach and say, tell me about your experience. Tell me about what drives you to present yourself in this way. What are you hoping to experience when you present yourself in this way with other people? Because I want to be seen. I want to be loved. I want to be accepted. Well, we all do.
What are some of the best questions, the 2 or 3 best questions you have in your toolbox that the average Christian could use to really help them engage people, engage conversation rather than pushing people away? What would be 2 or 3 of those questions be?
I think just leaning in with curiosity to say, my experience, my view of the world is limited. You seem to know more about this lens or this experience. Can you teach me? Teach me about what you know, about how you experience that. Tell me about yourself, right? We love talking about ourselves.
We all do. Yeah.
And so leaning in that, and then we tend to get defensive. We tend to bring out the hammer the closer that someone gets to actually our experience. If they're completely different than us, it's often easier to be curious because we don't really have any skin in the game. It doesn't affect us. If they get closer and closer to us and then differ from us, we tend to become more defensive because we take it personally then.
Interesting. It's
as if they're saying, I'm like you, but I'm like this. And then our perspective is like, well, I'm not like that. And so the closer they get to us as counselors, we have to train our students. Most of them are pretty open and accepting in just walking through life with people that are very different from them. The hardest time for me and for our counselors we train to hold your tongue is like when I have someone who would be from a similar church background and has bad hermeneutics on a section. It's like, well, no, that's not what that passage means. No, that's not necessarily my role. I need to hold my tongue. The closer, though, they get to my experience, the more I align with them and see divergences further on. So some of our questions is to hold that defensiveness and continue to be open, to be like Columbo and just ask questions. Tell me more about that. Tell me how you got here. You're in this. We kind of both got here together, but you took a different route. Tell me how you got here. Tell me how you perceive God. What God's love is like. How would you like God to love you? What would that mean? Some of those open questions.
So that's the engagement part. That's the fishing pole. How do you bring truth into that then? Mm-hmm. At some point, people need truth. So how do you do that as a counselor?
Yeah, we kind of walk out the implications of those things. And so we try to test it, or like Dr. Phil would say, like, how's that working for you? Right?
Exactly.
So you want a God who loves you the way that you perceive things or the way that you want them to be. At what point would that not be love? Right? So asking the implications of that is, I love my children, but I'm not going to give them everything they want because that's not love.
And that's great. And the reason I'm going here is what the average person doesn't understand is really the power of good questions. What I learned in politics is if I'm the one asking the questions, I control the outcome, period. And I imagine the whole area of mental health, it's much the same. By asking good questions, you can direct people in their thinking. Instead of asking, how does it make you feel, I ask, well, how do you think that makes God feel? Oh, I hadn't thought about that. Well, let's unpack that. And you get people answering the right questions. You don't have to pull out your hammer.
One of the distinctions, though, even in doing counseling, is I want to try to prevent the client from going on the defensive, which is unique, actually, from what then you're doing. If we're engaging with somebody in the culture around, we want to stay on the offensive and want to kind of put them on the defensive.
But it's better to do that through questions than through making hard and fast statements. Yeah,
that's right. But in counseling, if they go on the defensive, they start to shut down.
Yeah.
And so we have to kind of straddle the tension and continue to ask questions, but allow them. We're really just trying to spark their own curiosity. Alfred Adler has all these great common sense techniques, and it's things like, we'll act as if. So if you're not sure, like I met with somebody a couple weeks ago that said they don't have a problem with drinking. And so the common response is like, all right, well, if you don't have a problem with drinking, how about you just stop drinking for this weekend and act as if you don't have a problem with it and see what happens. Let's see if you can do that. Or
that's what I call being shrewd.
That's right. Yeah. Or things like one of his other ones. Well, actually, Adler coined reverse psychology, so that's one of his things. But spitting in the client's soup is another strategy, and so it's this idea.
That sounds yucky, but
it is. But you've probably done it and didn't realize it. So it's like if there's one piece of pie left, and I have two older brothers, one of us will lick it, right? You lick the pie, and then it makes it undesirable for anyone else. And so therapeutically, we kind of do that. We bring it to the extreme and make it undesirable, and say like, all right, well, that you don't want to do that anymore, and reverse it.
That's good. Actually, it reminds me of a story of when Tom Landry was coach of the Dallas Cowboys. He would, during training camp, he wouldn't let any of the men start eating until they prayed. So training camp, they'd have these long tables, and one day a friend of my dad's, who was the chaplain at the time of the Cowboys, was watching what was going on. They brought these big bowls of fried chicken out. And so one of the big linemen said, well, that one's mine, and that one's mine. And he said, I saw this little rookie wide receiver who was either this dumbest guy I ever saw or the gutsiest guy I ever saw. He said, I still didn't decide. And this little wide receiver goes, you can have it, you can have it, you can have it. Licked his finger and touched each of those pieces of chicken. That's exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. And we do that in discussions with people. Say, okay, well, if God is the God of your own making and he gives you your selfish desires, where does that leave you? Keller's book, Jesus the King, he cites the New York Times article about how most people that go into Hollywood go in because they're hoping to be successful. And what we see actually is as people become successful, they're less content than they were before.
Yeah. See that all the time.
And that's that piece even of licking the cookies, saying like, all right, well, in 1 year, the two wealthiest men a couple of years ago, Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates, both got divorced and dropped from being the wealthiest as a result. But if you could be that wealthy and still not be happy in your relationships, then none of the rest of us have any hope if that's what we think we need.
Yeah, they asked John Paul Getty, who used to be the wealthiest man in America and really in the world, they asked him one time, how much is enough? And he said, just a little more. It's never enough. It's never enough to make us happy and to satisfy us. Physical things will never satisfy that inner need, that spiritual need that God created inside of each of us. Yeah, that's critical. Well, let me ask you one more time. What do you think is the best question a believer can ask, especially of a non-believer, to begin engaging them in the God conversation? What's the best question that will be non-threatening, but can really begin to engage the God conversation? What would that look like? Have you thought about that one?
I haven't much. I mean, I think I would ask, what would you say to someone who believes in God? Because it gives them the expertise, it puts them on that position, and it lets them have to work out who they think God is without actually having to define who God is for themselves.
So repeat that again.
Who would you say God is, or what would you say to someone who believes in God?
That's a great starting point. So many times I heard my dad say we can trace all our human problems to our view of God. So we need to figure out how to engage that God question. Now, a lot of you probably heard that question with, a flat tire is not a result of my view of God. That's true. But how you respond to that flat tire is a result of how you view God. Is it a problem, or is it an opportunity to see God work? And see, that's what we're doing. So to engage that God question somehow or some way, especially with people who are hurting, it is so critical. I was doing a God is Issue seminar up in Northern California, just north of San Francisco. It was a Friday night. There were about 200 people there, and it's a 2-hour seminar in the evening. First part was lecture, the second half is all Q&A and case studies. And I got to the Q&A part, and the guy stood up and said, I'm the head of the Gay Lesbian Alliance here in town. I've got a question for you. And he was ready to do battle. And I thought, well, I've got to defang this guy first so we can actually have a conversation. And so I said, okay, stop right there. In order to have a conversation, we need to agree on one thing. If we can't agree on it, we can't have a conversation. You want to know what it is? He said, yeah. He said, we have to agree that God loves you just as much as he loves me. Can we agree on it? He went, oh, okay. So I said, so what's your next question? At that point, he's been defanged. And with 200 people standing there, he's not going to keep on being a jerk. If he is, he loses and he knows it. I mean, we all instinctively know If we continue being a jerk when the other person is really offered an olive branch in front of all these people, that's our bad. That's on us. So for the next hour and a half, supposed to only go another hour and a half, he was up and down asking questions. And most of his questions reflected a very, very shallow view of theology and a very shallow view of Christianity. But finally, after an hour and a half, he stood up and said, we're just not that far apart. Now then, here is, for me, where the balance between truth and love comes in. Yeah, I had a respectful conversation. It was very straightforward, but very respectful. I did not demean him in any way. But when he said that, I said, actually, we couldn't be further apart. And he had this puzzled look on his face. I said, let me explain. You start with your behavior, and you try to conform God to your behavior. Whereas I try to start with who God is and conform my behavior and my entire life to who God is. I said, as long as our starting points are so radically different, we'll never really find common ground.
Mm-hmm.
Oh. And sat down. See, I had answered his real question. It is, why can't we just see everything the same? And once he understood that concept, that it was a starting point. His starting point was himself and his behavior. My starting point is who God is. Once he understood that our starting points were so radically divergent, he finally understood why we disagreed. Now, we disagreed agreeably. We had a great conversation, even though he had come in loaded for bear. But it's because, one, I asked a lot of questions, but two, I defanged him on the front end. And we need to do that with culture. We need to lead with God's love. Although man's sin is real, and we need to bring that into the conversation, we need to start with the love of God, because it's the love of God that draws all of us to the Father. It's not his justice that draws us.
Right.
We have to deal with his justice, but it's his love that draws us. And we ought to remember that as we engage the culture. Truth is not going to draw people by and large. Love will. We never compromise the truth. We never downplay it, but we never compromise God's love either. Well, as we bring this to a close, what is the one thing, if you could say anything you wanted to the average 20-something out there, as they're really getting started in life, what is the one wise uncle piece of advice that you would give them with your background in counseling?
I would say find a group of people that love you in spite of yourself and will speak truth to you, and that can hold you accountable for the decisions in life that you make that sometimes you don't like and you don't want to be with, but that will be there for you and with you all the time.
Wow. Okay, if you heard nothing else in this entire podcast, that was worth the price of the whole podcast.
Well, and the flip of that is be that group for somebody else, right? Because that's the struggle, is people want that and can't find it. So, as they say, right, you have to be a friend to have a friend. So find someone to befriend, and then find people that can befriend you.
Yeah, and that's phenomenal. As I tell people all the time, so how do I do that? Well, just follow the words of Jesus. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If you do that, you will find friends. Because everybody wants kindness. Everybody wants to be heard. Everybody wants to be seen, as you said earlier. And by using that principle, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, you'll find, if you really, really live that principle out, you'll find you'll have friends. Well, Seth, thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thank you.
We are so grateful to you. And by the way, to our listeners, if you're interested in going into counseling or anything in this area, Columbia International University is really has a great program, and they're continuing to push into it. And guys like Seth here, you've seen today, will be here to help mentor you and teach you and give you some rails to run on. So if that's where God is pushing you in your heart, I hope you'll consider Columbia International University. At least take a good look at it. Well, folks, Seth, thank you for your time. Thank you for just kind of talking with us today, sharing your heart. I know this will be helpful to many of our listeners who are kind of struggling with what's the balance there as believers, as we're reaching out to society, and even as we see the broken parts in our own lives. How do we move forward?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much.